describe electrosensitivity?
Electrical sensitivity is when people start reacting, their body starts reacting to electromagnetic fields. Generally speaking, the electromagnetic fields that they'll be reacting to is wireless. So it'll be wireless communications, it'll be Wi-Fi, it'll be cordless phones, deck phones, mobile phones, masts. All of them emitting signals that our body has never experienced before. And when people start to become affected, when I became affected, the way that it starts to affect you is, generally speaking, it's your head first, and it will start giving you pains in your head. But I hate to use the word headache because it's pains in your head that is unlike any other headache you've ever had before.
Most people's complaints are things like cardiac arrhythmia, insomnia, headache, visual disturbance, vertigo, different kinds of paresthesias or neurasthesias where they are feeling unusual sensations within their body. But really it can also affect endocrine function, thyroid function. Again, the list is really endless.
In my particular case, and this is not everybody's case, if I then don't get out of the environment, I start getting quite severe pains in my gut, and that will then mean it's too late, and I will then start bleeding internally.
I think that the symptoms are so diverse, and the associations that people make are very difficult to accept if you have no knowledge of this subject, which most physicians do not have. And that's no fault of their own. We're not trained to recognise this condition. It's very innovative, and our understanding of it is entirely embryonic at this stage. We're at the very first steps of unravelling and fully understanding this condition.
Brian, like many sufferers of electrosensitivity, has been forced to make radical changes to his home.
These two rooms have been completely shielded in metal foil, so that this room and the bedroom are a Faraday cage. And if you actually check the electromagnetic fields, or indeed the microwaves, and this machine is simply converting microwaves to noise, you find that the mast that is about half a mile away over there, which causes me a problem, by shielding the room and putting metallized glass, means that I can eliminate most of the electromagnetic fields.
The aspects of an organism that allow it to detect and respond to electromagnetic fields, you could say this word's going to use it in a number of different contexts, and if you bisect it and break it down, electrically sensitive, you could say that really that's a response to life itself. In that, for example, if we're looking at an organism to determine the presence of life, we're really looking for the presence of electricity. So with the electrocardiogram, for example, the ECG, and the electroencephalogram, the EEG, what we're looking at there is the presence of electricity from those target organs, the brain and the heart. And when we see the presence of that, that's a sign that there's life. So in a way, given that on a cellular level, electromagnetic fields are part of life itself, we could say that all life is electromagnetically sensitive.
Desperate to convince people that electrosensitivity was genuine, Brian and a number of other sufferers signed up to a landmark experiment at Essex University. The experiment, run by Elaine Fox, would sadly become the definitive work on the subject.
You have to go into a shielded room, and you go in there for a relatively short period of time, and the mast is on for 10 minutes and off for 10 minutes and on for 10 minutes, and to see whether you can detect whether it's on or not. And I went into the room having told them that I would not be able to tell them whether the mast was on or off or on.
Why's that?
because their understanding of how you react to this is wrong. This is not a case with most people where you turn the mast on and, oh, I'm affected. They turn the mast off, oh, I'm okay again. It doesn't work like that. I suffer with hay fever. And when I go into a field where there's pollen, it takes a while before I'll be affected. But it takes a long time before I'm not affected. I can be removed from the hay field for 24 hours, but I'll still be feeling my hay fever. And electrical sensitivity with most people is a little bit like that.
The way the team had set up the experiment meant it would be almost impossible for Brian and the other volunteers to prove they were being affected. Not that it would matter, as the team had inexplicably decided to do away with any form of vetting procedure.
For one thing, people appear to be sensitive to different things. I'm sensitive to 3G mobile phones, I'm sensitive to GSM mobile phones, for example. There are differences in the way the modulation works. I have no idea whether they're right in their sensitivities, but if that is the case, then it makes sense that the people who you've got into your study claim to be sensitive to exactly the signal that you're going to be exposing them to. If you have someone that, for example, is always sensitive to Wi-Fi, but they're never sensitive to mobile phones, if they exist, then you make sure that what they're being exposed to is Wi-Fi and not mobile phones, because you're actually trying to prove whether they're sensitive to what they're saying they are. None of that differentiation was done. It was really, if you claim to be sensitive to anything at all that happened to be electromagnetic, you were in.
Well, one of the reasons why I thought it was quite important was I help people who are electrically sensitive. And a couple of months before, I'd actually been to a lady's house who thought she was electrically sensitive, just to try and help her and to explain to her what electrical sensitivity was and what might be causing her problem. And to cut a long story short, it was obvious that this particular lady had a problem, but she was not electrically sensitive. She was definitely not electrically sensitive. But in the going of the conversation, she'd signed up for the Essex trials to try and find out whether she was electrically sensitive. Well, my heart missed a beat. Well, here's somebody that's not electrically sensitive, and they've signed up to go to Essex, and Essex are telling me they don't have a vetting procedure.
What they actually found, and this is based on the text in their paper itself, I'm not sort of paraphrasing, is they needed, according to them, with the level of response they were expecting to see from sensitive people, they would need about 132 people, participants in their study, to show a statistically significant effect. That's how much population, if you like, they would need. That's how much data they would need in their study findings before they could say this group is clearly more sensitive than that group. What they got was 44. So from the very outset, they only had a third of the data they expected that they would need to find anything anyway. What they ended up finding was a near statistically significant risk anyway, i.e. the people who claimed to be sensitive showed that they were sensitive with a significance of about 90%. So the borderline at which a scientific paper says, yes, this is statistically significant, is 95%. If you don't get that level of certainty, it's not a statistical finding at all. It could be random chance and noise. They got something which was 90% certainty of an increase in risk, and of course it fails the magic bar at which you can call it a statistically significant result, and it was written off as this demonstrates that people aren't sensitive, when actually it did no such thing.
The constant exposure to the mast took its toll on a number of the volunteers, making some of them so sick they were forced to withdraw from the experiment. For Brian, the effects of the experiment would be felt long after he left Essex.
I've had, my first colonoscopy was 7 years ago, my second one was 4 years ago, my third one was about a year ago. There's nothing the matter with me, there's nothing the matter with me. Absolutely, you know, you're imagining it. I've got colon cancer. So from the first time that I bled to the time of removing the polyp was 7 years. When I asked the doctor how long does it take to cancer to develop, 7 years. So you can virtually track the time when I went to Essex, and there was one occasion before where I started bleeding. With that bleeding has caused me colon cancer.
How could such a botched experiment be held up as such a definitive piece of research? Why would such an experienced team make such fundamental and obvious errors in their work? Could it be anything to do with those who provided the funding? The Essex experiment is one of a number of experiments funded by the MTHR, a company set up and funded by the mobile industry themselves. Could you explain what MTHR does and how MTHR is funded?
Yes, the MTHR programme is funded jointly by the UK government and the mobile telecommunications industry, and it funds research into possible adverse health effects related to mobile phone technology.
The whole issue of who funds scientific research is a thorny issue. I know many scientists like myself who, when they get a new study to read, the first thing they turn to is the back of the page where it says who funded it.
Is there, do you think, maybe a conflict of interest in the mobile phone industry funding research into the harm that it does?
Well, of course there is a potential conflict of interest, and that's why a programme of funding like this has to be carefully managed.
I've done a lot of work with the telecommunications industry because I happen to have I organise the communication workers representation in here, and so I've talked to these people for a long time. I think they would like to be objective, but they are driven, particularly in a market where they're fighting each other for market share by profit, and therefore they may fund research, but much like the pharmaceutical industry, you often find that they're hiring people who've already spoken on their side of the argument.
Scientists aren't pop stars, they don't earn a lot of money, they have houses to finance, they have families to look after. Who can blame them for recognising that if they find the wrong results, they're not going to get another job from that source at any rate?
There are psychological pressures, even in the absence of actual pressures, which may or may not be present in individual circumstances. There are clearly psychological pressures to conform and to please the organisation providing your funding.
You feel obliged.
You feel obliged, you feel obliged.
There are some really solid statistics showing that where there is an issue over electromagnetic field effects, that the studies funded by the utilities or by the power industry or the radio industry or by the mobile phone industry are funded by them, that the studies tend to be significantly negative, whereas the studies funded independently within universities and so on tend not to be so.
It's a challenging area in which to research. It's not easy to do studies of that sort, and because of the constraints of doing research in human subjects, you're not going to have perfect research studies. There are always going to be limitations.
Is this a real condition? Yes, absolutely it is. At present, the World Health Organization statements regarding this are that it is real and symptoms can be severe and disabling. Figures for electromagnetic hypersensitivity are around 2 to 3%. Those are people who've had their life extremely affected by this condition. But, as I've previously mentioned, on a cellular level, 100% of people are reacting. That means that the healthcare consequences of not taking this seriously and not recognising it are potentially huge. And the numbers of people that have mild or moderate electrical sensitivity are probably far higher than we estimate.
It leaves us with a tape recording of an experimental link-up between a standard telephone and a unique mobile handset. A dialing tone. And that's quite an achievement, because it's one thing to transmit a conversation, it's another to transmit accurate digital information. Now, an extension at the Research Institute in Chelmsford, which has perfected this technique. On the other end of this should be Liz Charnock.
With the advent of the mobile phone in the 1980s, came the need to build a network of antennas to support them. Since then, the telecom companies have erected over 5 million mobile phone masts around the world. But incredibly, prior to filling the air with microwave frequencies, they didn't conduct a single piece of research to ensure there wouldn't be any long-term health effects from such exposure. The grid was built without first making sure it was safe.
Thank you for your help.